Elena sits in a sterile hospital waiting room, her hands shaking as she stares at the cardiac unit doors. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting harsh shadows across her tear-streaked face. She whispers to herself, 32 years of marriage, and I thought I knew everything about my husband, David. I was wrong. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The camera focuses on Elena's wedding ring as she continues, her voice barely audible in the empty corridor. My name is Elena Martinez, and I'm 58 years old. 3 hours ago, I was making David's morning coffee, just like I have every single day for over 3 decades. 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in his favorite blue mug. He kissed my forehead and said he'd see me at dinner. That was supposed to be our normal Thursday. She pauses, touching the cross necklace at her throat, a gift from David on their 10th anniversary. Instead, I got a phone call at 2:47 p.m. from Cedar Valley Hospital. Mrs. Martinez, your husband has suffered a heart attack. We need you to come immediately. My entire world stopped. David, my David, the man who jogged every morning and ate the healthy meals I prepared, was fighting for his life. Elena's eyes drift to the vending machine humming in the corner. Its bright lights are a stark contrast to the dim waiting area. I drove here in a panic, still wearing my apron from baking his favorite chocolate chip cookies. I ran through those double doors, expecting the worst, preparing myself to be a widow. But Dr. Hayes, the cardiologist, told me David was stable. He's going to be fine, Mrs. Martinez. The surgery was successful. He's lucky you got here so quickly. She takes a shaky breath, her voice growing stronger. I felt this overwhelming relief wash over me. I thanked God. I called our son Marcus in Denver. I called our daughter Isabella in Austin. I was planning how I'd take care of David during his recovery, thinking about converting the guest room downstairs so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. I was being the devoted wife I'd always been. Elena's expression darkens as she continues. Then Nurse Patricia walked up to me with her clipboard and kind eyes. She said, Mrs. Martinez, we've updated David's emergency contacts in our system. You're listed as primary, which is perfect since you're here. His other emergency contact should be arriving shortly. Other emergency contact. She repeats the words slowly, as if tasting something bitter. I looked at her confused. I'm sorry. What other emergency contact? Patricia checked her tablet. A Miss Sophia Chen. Actually, it shows here she recently changed her name to Sophia Martinez. She's driving down from Dallas and should be here within the hour. Elena's voice cracked slightly. Sophia Martinez, someone I'd never heard of, was carrying my husband's last name. In that moment, sitting in that cold hospital chair, I realized my entire marriage had been a lie. The nurse had just told me David's condition was stable after his heart attack. But then she said something that shattered my world completely. There was another woman who David trusted enough to list as his emergency contact. Another woman who had taken my name. She looks directly at the camera, her brown eyes now filled with a mixture of pain and determination. I was his wife of 32 years, and I was about to discover I knew nothing about the man I devoted my entire adult life to. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and my own strength. Elena's voice softens as she remembers happier times. To understand how devastating this betrayal was, you need to know what my life looked like before. For 32 years, I lived what I thought was the American dream. I was Mrs. David Martinez, proud wife of one of Houston's most respected architects, mother to 2 incredible children, and keeper of a home that was always filled with warmth and love. She pauses, a sad smile crossing her face. Every single morning at 5:30 a.m., my alarm would ring. Not because I had to be anywhere, but because David needed his routine. I'd slip out of bed quietly, pad downstairs in my slippers, and start the coffee maker. 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in his favorite blue mug, the one Marcus made him in pottery class when he was 12. By 6:15, David would come down in his pressed shirt and tie, kiss my forehead, and say, "Morning, beautiful. What would I do without you?" Elena's eyes light up despite her current pain. I managed everything. The house payments, the children's schedules, the grocery shopping, the dinner parties for David's clients. When Marcus wanted to play Little League, I drove him to every practice and game for 6 years. When Isabella decided she wanted to be a lawyer like her hero Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I helped her with college applications and drove her to every campus visit from Texas to California. She describes their evening routine with obvious nostalgia. David would walk through our front door every evening at exactly 6:15 p.m. I'd have dinner ready. Pot roast on Sundays, his favorite, chicken enchiladas on Tuesdays, grilled salmon on Fridays. We'd sit at our kitchen table, the one we bought when we first got married, and he'd tell me about his day, which clients were difficult, which projects were exciting, and how proud he was when his designs were featured in Houston Architecture Monthly. Elena's voice becomes wistful. Sundays were my favorite. After church, we'd drive to my mother Carmen's house in Katy. David would help her fix whatever was broken, a leaky faucet, a squeaky door hinge. Then we'd all sit around her dining room table, and David would carve the roast while I served mashed potatoes and green beans to Marcus and Isabella. "Elena makes the best pot roast in Texas," he'd announce every single Sunday, then kiss my forehead. My children would roll their eyes, but I felt like the luckiest woman alive. She describes their shared dreams and adventures. We took family vacations to Colorado every summer, stayed in the same cabin by the lake. David would teach Marcus to fish while Isabella and I collected wildflowers for pressed flower art. In the evenings, we'd play board games and make s'mores around the fire pit. David would pull me close and whisper, "This is perfect, Elena. You've given me the perfect life." Elena's expression grows more thoughtful. Looking back now, I realize the changes started about 3 years ago. David began working later, sometimes not coming home until 8 or 9 p.m. Big project deadline, he'd explain, kissing my cheek as he reheated the dinner I'd kept warm for him. Then came the weekend work sessions. "Sorry, honey. The Henderson project needs my attention," he'd say, grabbing his laptop and heading to the office on Saturdays. Her voice becomes quieter. The business trips increase too. Chicago, Denver, Dallas, always for client meetings or industry conferences. I never questioned it because I trusted him completely. David had never given me a single reason to doubt his faithfulness. I felt so secure in our love, so confident in our partnership. I thought we were unbreakable. Elena shakes her head sadly. I was living in a beautiful bubble, completely unaware that my husband was already building a life that didn't include me. Elena's expression grows more serious as she recalls the moment that should have been her wake-up call. The first crack in my perfect world happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in March, about 6 months before David's heart attack. I was in our master bathroom folding towels and listening to David sing off-key in the shower, something he'd done for 30 years. Frank Sinatra's "Fly Me to the Moon" was his go-to-shower song, and it always made me smile. She pauses, her fingers unconsciously twisting her wedding ring. His phone started ringing on the nightstand. Now, David's phone rarely rang after 7 p.m. He was strict about work-life balance, or so I thought. The ringing was persistent, stopping and starting again immediately. I figured it might be an emergency with a client or maybe Marcus calling from Denver with car trouble. Elena's voice becomes more detailed as she relives the moment. I walked over and saw Sophia Henderson project lighting up a screen. I thought how dedicated he was calling so late about work. So I answered with my usual cheerful voice. "Hello, this is Mrs. Martinez. David's in the shower, but I can take a message." The memory clearly still stings. There was this long pause, maybe 3 or 4 seconds of complete silence. Then this smooth, professional voice said, "Oh, I didn't realize is David there? It's about the Henderson project." Her tone was strange. Not exactly rude, but surprised, like she hadn't expected me to exist. Elena describes her growing unease. I tried to be helpful the way I always was with David's work contacts. I'm his wife, Elena. I'd be happy to let him know you called, or you can leave a message and I'll make sure he gets it first thing tomorrow. But instead of giving me a message, she quickly said, "Oh, no. That's okay. I'll just email him about the project details." Then she hung up before I could even say goodbye. She shakes her head, remembering her confusion. I stood there holding David's phone, staring at the screen. Something felt off. In 32 years of marriage, David's colleagues had always been friendly when they called. They'd ask how I was doing, maybe chat about the weather, or mention their own spouses. This woman couldn't get off the phone fast enough when she realized I wasn't David. Elena describes the conversation that followed. When David came out of the shower, his hair still damp and wearing his favorite navy blue robe, I mentioned the call casually. "Honey, someone named Sophia called about the Henderson project. She said she'd just email you instead." I was folding his work shirts while I talked, not thinking much of it. Her voice becomes more pointed. But David's reaction was what really should have alarmed me. He stopped twirling his hair and looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not panic exactly, but definitely concern. Then he smiled, but it wasn't his usual warm smile. It was careful, practiced. "Oh, that's just Sophia Chin from the office. She handles most of our client communications now. Very dedicated worker, always thinking about projects." Elena's tone becomes more reflective. Here's what I should have noticed. David said her name with a slight smile, the same soft way he used to say my name when we were dating. Sophia rolled off his tongue like he'd been practicing it. And he used her full name. David never used full names for coworkers. It was always Mike from accounting or Janet in HR. Never Michael Peterson or Janet Williams. She looks directly at the camera. But I pushed that feeling down. I told myself I was being paranoid, maybe watching too many Lifetime movies with my mother, Carmen. After 32 years of faithfulness, David had earned my trust. I convinced myself the strange phone call meant nothing. That was my first mistake. Elena's voice becomes heavier as she describes the slow dissolution of her marriage. After that phone call, I started noticing things I'd been blind to before. It wasn't like a switch flipped overnight. It was more like watching a flower wilt petal by petal. The changes were so gradual that I kept convincing myself I was imagining them. She takes a deep breath, her eyes distant with painful memories. David stopped seeing me. I don't mean he looked through me. I mean he literally stopped noticing when I was in the room. I'd spend an hour getting ready for our monthly dinner at Romano's, wearing the burgundy dress he once said made my eyes sparkle. I'd walk into the living room and say, "Ready to go, honey?" And he'd glance up from his phone for maybe 2 seconds, nod, and go back to scrolling. "No, you look beautiful." "No, I love that dress." Just a distracted nod. Elena's frustration becomes evident as she continues. Our conversation started dying slow deaths. I tried to tell him about my day, how the new volunteer coordinator at the animal shelter was implementing changes, or how my mother, Carmen, was thinking about selling her house and moving to assisted living. David would make these non-committal "machem" sounds while his fingers tapped away at his phone. When I'd ask, "Are you listening?" he'd look up with his practiced smile and say, "Of course, honey. You were talking about your mother." She describes the growing silence at home. Our Sunday dinners became exercises in awkwardness. David would sit at our kitchen table, the same spot he'd occupied for 3 decades, but mentally, he was somewhere else entirely. I'd ask about his projects, and he'd give me these generic answers, just the usual client stuff, or you wouldn't find it interesting. When I suggested we plan a weekend trip to San Antonio like we used to, he'd say, "Maybe next month. Work is crazy right now." Elena's voice cracked slightly. The worst part was how I started questioning everything about myself. I began standing in front of our bedroom mirror, wondering if I'd become boring. Had I gained too much weight? Were my laugh lines too deep? I started buying new clothes, trying different hairstyles, even signed up for a cooking class to learn French cuisine, thinking maybe I could win back his attention. She shakes her head at the memory. I remember one evening in April, I made David's absolute favorite meal, his grandmother's recipe for chicken mole that I'd spent 4 hours preparing. I set the table with our good china, lit candles, even put on the jazz playlist we used to dance to in our kitchen. When David walked in, he barely glanced at the table. He said, "Thanks. This looks good," took his plate, and went to eat in his office while reviewing blueprints. Elena's voice becomes more strained. I sat alone at that beautifully set table, surrounded by flickering candles and the smell of hand-ground spices, and I felt completely invisible. I started eating my dinner and crying at the same time, trying to figure out when I'd become a stranger in my own marriage. She describes the daily erosion of intimacy. David stopped reaching for my hand during our evening walks around the neighborhood. He'd walk slightly ahead of me, his phone in his hand, responding to texts. When I try to link arms like we'd done for 30 years, he'd pat my hand absently and then step away to quickly handle this work thing. Elena looks directly at the camera. I was disappearing from my own life piece by piece. And the man who'd promised to love me forever was helping me vanish. But I still believed it was just a rough patch. I had no idea that David wasn't just pulling away from me. He was running towards someone else. Elena's face flushes with remembered embarrassment as she recalls the moment that cut deepest. The humiliation that broke something inside me happened at David's company Christmas party in December. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks because it felt like our first real night out together in months. I bought a new emerald green dress. David used to say green was my color and spent extra time on my hair and makeup. She pauses, her voice becoming more vulnerable. The party was at the downtown Marriott Ballroom, the same place where David's firm celebrated every year. I knew most of the faces, architects, and their spouses I'd been socializing with for over a decade. As we walked in, David immediately started networking, moving from group to group while I followed behind like an afterthought. Elena describes the pivotal moment with painful clarity. About an hour into the party, I was standing by the appetizer table trying to look busy while David talked shop across the room. I saw him laughing with a group of colleagues, including this stunning Asian woman I didn't recognize. She was probably mid-30s, wearing a sleek black cocktail dress and pearl earrings that caught the light every time she moved. Her confidence was magnetic, the way she gestured while talking, how everyone leaned in to hear her speak. Her voice grows quieter. I decided to join them, thinking it was time to meet David's newer colleagues. As I approached, I heard David say, "The Henderson Project wouldn't have been possible without Sophia's innovative approach to the structural challenges." The way he said her name with this tone of admiration and respect. It was how he used to talk about my achievements when we were younger. Elena continues with the devastating encounter. When I reached the group, David didn't immediately introduce me. I had to clear my throat and extend my hand to the woman myself. Malena Martinez, David Suifa. You must be Sophia. She turned to me with this perfect smile and shook my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. "Oh, Elena, I'm Sophia Chen. I've heard so much about you from David." The conversation that followed still stings. I tried to be warm and engaging the way I'd always been at these work functions. "David tells me you're wonderful with the clients. It's so nice to have dedicated people like you on the team." But Sophia's smile seemed to tighten slightly. "Well, David and I do work very closely together. We make quite the team on these complex projects. We understand each other's vision perfectly." Elena's voice becomes more pained. The other colleagues started drifting away to refresh their drinks, leaving me standing there with Sophia and David. I felt this strange tension, like I was intruding on something private. David seemed more animated talking to her about work than he'd been with me in months. When Sophia mentioned a recent business dinner they'd had, David laughed and said, "Sophia always orders the most adventurous dishes. She's taught me to be more experimental with food." The crushing blow came next. I excused myself to use the restroom, and as I walked away, I heard Sophia talking to Janet from HR behind me. Her voice carried just enough for me to catch the words. David's wife seems sweet, but she's so domestic, very traditional. I can see why he needs intellectual stimulation elsewhere. Some men outgrow their first marriages, you know. Elena's voice breaks slightly. I stood in that hotel bathroom staring at my reflection in the mirror and realized that this woman, this stranger, saw me as David's past while she positioned herself as his future. The worst part wasn't what she said. It was that I could see she was probably right. David did seem more alive when he talked to her than he'd been with me in years. She looks at the camera with tears in her eyes. That night, I became a ghost in my own husband's life. Elena's voice becomes steadier, but there's a deep sadness in her eyes as she recounts the moment her marriage truly ended. 2 weeks after that humiliating Christmas party, I was doing laundry on a Saturday morning, something I'd done every weekend for 32 years. David had left early for what he called an emergency client meeting, kissing my cheek absently as he rushed out the door with his leather briefcase. She describes the discovery with painful precision. I was checking his pockets before putting his gray wool suit in the dry cleaning bag, the same routine I'd followed for decades. Usually, I'd find receipts for gas or maybe a business card from a new client. But this time, my fingers found a folded piece of paper tucked deep in his inside jacket pocket. Elena's hands unconsciously mimic unfolding the receipt. It was a dinner receipt from Romano's, our special place, the restaurant where David proposed 34 years ago, where we celebrated every anniversary. The receipt was dated the previous Thursday, the same night David said he was working late on the Henderson project. 2 entrees, lobster ravioli and filet mignon. 2 glasses of the Cabernet Sauvignon we always ordered for special occasions. The total was $187.50, exactly what David and I usually spent on our anniversary dinners. Her voice becomes more strained. I stood in our laundry room holding this piece of paper, and my whole body started shaking. David had taken another woman to our place, ordered our wine, probably sat at our usual table by the window overlooking the garden, the same table where he'd gotten down on one knee all those years ago. Elena describes the confrontation that followed. When David came home that evening, I was sitting at our kitchen table with the receipt spread out in front of me. I'd spent the entire day rehearsing what I wanted to say. But when I saw his face, all my prepared words disappeared. I simply asked, "David, can you explain this?" and slid the receipt across the table. She pauses, remembering his reaction. David barely glanced at it before his expression hardened. Not guilt, not remorse, irritation. He looked at me like I was a child who'd misbehaved. "Elena, you're becoming paranoid." It was a business dinner with the Henderson clients. Sometimes these meetings require a more upscale environment than the office conference room. Elena's voice grows stronger with indignation. I looked him directly in the eye and said, "At Romano's, our place on a Thursday night when you told me you were working late at the office." David's jaw tightened, and he spoke to me in a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, dismissive, almost cruel. "Elena, it's just a restaurant. You don't own Romano's. You're being completely irrational about this." The breaking point comes next. That word, irrational, was like a slap across my face. After 32 years of being the rational one, the stable one, the one who managed everything while he pursued his dreams, he was calling me irrational for questioning an obvious lie. In that moment, something inside me just broke. Not shattered dramatically, but broke quietly, like a branch finally snapping under too much weight. Elena describes her decision. I didn't scream or throw the receipt at him. I didn't demand more explanations or beg him to tell me the truth. Instead, I stood up very calmly and said, "David, I'm going to stay at my mother's house for a few days. I need some space to think about our marriage." I walked upstairs, packed a small suitcase with a week's worth of clothes, and came back down to find David sitting in the exact same position, scrolling through his phone. Her voice becomes hollow with the memory. As I picked up my purse and car keys, David barely looked up. He didn't ask when I'd be back. Didn't try to stop me. Didn't even seem concerned. He just said, "Fine, Elena. Maybe some time apart will help you get some perspective on this situation." That's when I knew our marriage was already over. David had been done with me long before I was done with him. Elena's voice becomes raw with emotion as she describes her darkest period. I drove to my mother's house that night in complete silence, not even turning on the radio. The 20-minute drive felt like hours. And when I finally pulled into Carmen's driveway, I sat in my car for another 15 minutes, just staring at the little yellow house where I'd grown up. I couldn't bring myself to walk through that front door and admit that my marriage was falling apart. She pauses, touching the cross at her throat. When I finally went inside, my 82-year-old mother took one look at my face and knew everything. Carmen didn't ask questions. She just wrapped me in her arms like I was 7 years old again, and I completely fell apart. 32 years of being the strong one, the capable one, the one everyone could depend on. And I sobbed like a broken child on my mother's shoulder. Elena describes the devastating weeks that followed. I spent the next 3 weeks sleeping in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the same faded pink flower wallpaper I'd stared at as a teenager when boys broke my heart. But this wasn't teenage heartbreak. This was the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. I'd wake up every morning forgetting for just a moment that I wasn't in my own bed. Then reality would crash over me like ice water. Her voice becomes more vulnerable. The worst part was the silence from David. Not a single phone call, not one text message asking how I was doing or when I might come home. My phone would buzz and my heart would leap, thinking maybe he'd realized what he was losing, but it was always Marcus calling from Denver to check on me, or Isabella asking if I needed her to come home from Austin. Never David. Elena describes her mental state with painful honesty. I started questioning everything about myself. Was I really as boring as Sophia had said? Had I wasted my entire adult life being a housewife when I should have pursued my teaching degree? I'd lie awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling and wondering if David had been pretending to love me for years. Maybe I was just convenient, someone to manage his home and raise his children while he focused on building his career. She continues with the depth of her despair. Carmen would bring me tea and toast every morning because I'd stopped eating regular meals. She'd sit on the edge of my bed and stroke my hair while I cried, telling me stories about my father and how much he loved me. But even my mother's comfort couldn't fill the hole that David's betrayal had torn in my chest. Elena's voice cracks as she describes rock bottom. The lowest point came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I'd left. I was sitting at Carmen's kitchen table in my pajamas at 2 p.m., still unwashed, still crying, when I caught my reflection in the window. I looked like a ghost, hollowed, pale, completely defeated. I realized I was disappearing, not just from David's life, but from my own. She describes the moment of clarity. Carmen sat down across from me with her morning coffee and said something that changed everything. "Mija, you've been crying for your marriage for 2 weeks, but when was the last time David cried for it? When was the last time he fought for you?" I couldn't answer because David had never fought for our relationship. He'd simply moved on while I was still trying to save something that was already dead. Elena looks directly at the camera. That's when I realized I wasn't just mourning my marriage. I was mourning the woman I used to be, before I started making myself smaller to fit into David's life. But sitting in my mother's kitchen, I decided that woman deserved better than to disappear without a fight. Elena's expression hardens as she recalls the moment everything became crystal clear. 3 days after my conversation with Carmen, I realized I'd left my grandmother's silver-framed photo in David's home office, the picture of a boy Rosa that had been on my nightstand for 15 years. I needed that photo not just because it was precious to me, but because I was starting to understand that I needed to reclaim the pieces of myself that I'd scattered throughout David's life. She describes returning to the house with trepidation. I used my key to enter our home, though it no longer felt like our home on a Thursday afternoon when I knew David would be at work. The house felt different, colder somehow, like it was already rejecting me. I walked upstairs to get some additional clothes and then headed to David's office to retrieve my grandmother's photo. Elena's voice becomes more intense. David's office was always his sacred space. Mahogany desk, leather chair, diplomas, and awards covering the walls. I'd rarely gone in there except to dust or deliver coffee. As I reached for my grandmother's photo on the bookshelf, I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers with my elbow. They scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves. The discovery unfolds with devastating detail. As I bent down to pick them up, trying to put them back in order so David wouldn't know I'd been there, my eyes caught something that made my blood freeze. It was a life insurance policy. David's life insurance policy that I thought listed me as the primary beneficiary, but there in black and white was a name I recognized. Sophia Chen, primary beneficiary, $500,000. I was listed as secondary, entitled to only $50,000. Elena's hands shake as she continues. I stood there holding this document, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't just an affair. This was David systematically removing me from his life and replacing me with her. I kept picking up papers, and each one was like another knife to my heart. Bank statements for an account I'd never seen with both David and Sophia's names on it. Monthly deposits of $3,000 going back 8 months. The evidence accumulates with crushing weight. Then I found vacation photos that made me physically sick. David and Sophia on a beach in Cancun, the same resort where David and I had honeymooned 33 years ago. The photos were dated last October when David told me he was at an architecture conference in Chicago. There was Sophia in a red bikini, laughing as David carried her into the ocean. Another photo of them at a candlelit dinner. David looking at her the way he used to look at me. Elena's voice breaks slightly. But the worst discovery was a lease agreement for a downtown apartment signed by both David Martinez and Sophia Chen, dated 6 months ago. They had been living together part-time while I was home making his coffee every morning and wondering why he seemed so distant. The address was 1247 Maple Street, Unit 12B. I memorized it instantly. She describes the final crushing blow. At the bottom of the pile was a jewelry store receipt from Cartier dated our last wedding anniversary in June. It was for a diamond necklace worth $4,200, the same necklace I'd seen Sophia wearing at the Christmas party. While I'd been home that anniversary evening cooking David's favorite dinner and waiting for him to come home from his emergency client meeting, he was buying jewelry for another woman. Elena looks directly at the camera, her voice now steady with resolve. I sat on David's office floor, surrounded by evidence of his completely secret life, and finally understood the truth. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a temporary affair. David and Sophia had been building a future together while systematically erasing me from his present. They weren't just planning to replace me, they'd already started. Elena's voice becomes stronger, more determined as she describes the moment everything changed. After discovering David's secret life, I didn't immediately drive back to my mother's house to cry. Instead, I found myself driving downtown to 1247 Maple Street, the address on that lease agreement. I needed to see with my own eyes the life David had built without me. She describes the confrontation with reality. The Riverside Towers was this modern glass building with a doorman and valet parking. The kind of place David and I had always said was too pretentious for our taste. I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, just staring at the building. Then, at exactly 5:45 p.m., I saw David's silver BMW pull into the parking garage. My heart started pounding, but I didn't drive away. Elena's awakening begins to unfold. 20 minutes later, I watched David walk out of the elevator in the lobby, but he looked different. He was wearing jeans and a casual sweater I'd never seen before, carrying a bottle of wine and flowers. He looked happy, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him look at home in years. He was clearly going up to surprise Sophia after her workday. The realization hit her with startling clarity. As I sat there watching my husband of 32 years walk into his secret apartment building, something shifted inside me. For the first time in months, I wasn't crying. I wasn't questioning myself or wondering what I'd done wrong. Instead, I felt this clean, clarifying anger. Not the messy, desperate anger of betrayal, but the focused anger of someone who finally sees the truth. Elena describes her mental transformation. I realized that for months I'd been apologizing for existing. I'd been making myself smaller, trying to figure out how to win back a man who had already decided I wasn't worth keeping. I'd been competing for attention in my own marriage while David was living a completely different life with another woman. She continues with growing confidence. I drove away from that building, but instead of going to Carmen's house, I went to the library. I sat at a computer terminal and started researching divorce law in Texas. I looked up attorneys, read about asset division, and learned about my rights after 32 years of marriage. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. Elena's voice becomes more resolute. That evening, I called my daughter Isabella in Austin. When she answered, I said something that surprised us both. Isabella, this is your mother, and I need your help. Not as your confused, heartbroken mom, but as a woman who's ready to fight for what she deserves. Isabella was quiet for a moment, then said, Mom, you sound different, stronger, and I was stronger. She describes the conversation that changed everything. I told Isabella everything. The insurance policy, the apartment, the photos, all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Mom, as your daughter, I'm heartbroken for you. But as a lawyer, I'm furious on your behalf. Dad has been financially planning to abandon you. That's not just betrayal. It's financial abuse. Hearing my own daughter, a successful attorney, validate my feelings gave me permission to stop blaming myself. Elena looks directly at the camera with newfound determination. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about how to save my marriage. I was thinking about how to save myself. I realized that David hadn't just betrayed our marriage vows. He tried to erase my future. But I wasn't going to disappear quietly like he hoped. I was going to fight back. Her voice becomes steady and strong. That night, I stopped being David's victim and started being Elena's advocate. The woman who had supported his dreams for 32 years was finally ready to pursue her own. Elena's voice becomes strategic and deliberate as she describes her careful preparation. The next morning, I made a decision that would have shocked the old Elena. I was going to move back home and pretend everything was normal while I systematically prepared for my new life. David thought he was the only one who could live a double life, but he was about to learn that 32 years of managing a household had taught me a thing or two about planning and execution. She describes returning home with newfound purpose. When I walked through our front door that Friday evening, David was in the living room watching the news, just like always. He barely looked up when I set down my suitcase. "How was your time at your mother's?" he asked absently. I smiled and said, "Very enlightening. I'm ready to work on us." David seemed relieved that I was back to being compliant Elena, but he had no idea I was now strategic Elena. Elena details her methodical approach. Over the next 2 weeks, I began documenting everything with Isabella's guidance. I secretly photographed David's credit card statements, bank records, and any documents I could find. I took pictures of our valuable possessions, my grandmother's china, the artwork we collected, David's expensive watch collection. Isabella had given me a checklist of financial assets to locate, and I was determined to find every single account. She describes opening her own financial independence. The most empowering moment came when I drove to First National Bank and opened my own personal checking account for the first time in 32 years. I used my maiden name, Elena Rodriguez, and transferred my father's inheritance money that I'd foolishly put into our joint account years ago. Sitting across from that banker, signing my own name on my own account, I felt like I was reclaiming my identity one signature at a time. Elena's planning becomes more sophisticated. I contacted my college friend Janet, who'd become a successful real estate agent. I told her I needed to look at properties, somewhere David had never been, somewhere that would be completely mine. We spent Saturday afternoons looking at townhouses and condos while David was at his office, though I now knew he was probably at Sophia's apartment. She describes rediscovering herself professionally. The most surprising decision I made was calling the school district about substitute teaching positions. I'd taught elementary school before Marcus was born, and I'd always wondered what my life would have looked like if I'd continued my career. When Principal Martinez, no relation, called to offer me a position at Oakwood Elementary, I said yes without consulting David. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions about my own life. Elena's daily routine becomes her cover. Every morning, I continued making David's coffee exactly how he liked it. Two sugars, a splash of cream. I prepared his dinner, did his laundry, and listened to his vague stories about work. But now, I was operating with complete clarity. When David mentioned working late, I'd smile and say, "Of course, honey. I know how dedicated you are." Meanwhile, I was photographing his computer screen when he left it open, documenting his lies with timestamps and details. She describes the psychological shift. The strangest part was how calm I felt. David thought I'd accepted his neglect and was settling back into being his convenient housewife. He had no idea that every domestic task I performed was now part of my exit strategy. I was gathering evidence, securing my finances, and building my new life while he assumed I was just being the good wife I'd always been. Elena looks directly at the camera with quiet satisfaction. David believed he was the mastermind, but he'd underestimated the woman who'd spent 32 years managing every detail of his comfortable life. I was about to show him exactly how much planning and intelligence that had required. Elena's voice takes on a subtle satisfaction as she describes how the tables began to turn. While I was quietly building my exit strategy, strange things started happening to David and Sophia's perfect little world. At first, these seemed like coincidences, but looking back, I realized the universe was finally balancing the scales. She describes the first crack in their foundation. The Henderson Project, David and Sophia's biggest account worth over $300,000, suddenly pulled out without explanation. David came home that Tuesday evening looking genuinely confused and frustrated. "I don't understand what went wrong," he told me over dinner, actually engaging in real conversation for the first time in months. "Robert Henderson seemed completely satisfied with our progress. Now, he's saying they're going with a different firm." Elena's role in this reversal becomes clear. What David didn't know was that while organizing his office documents, I discovered some interesting billing irregularities. David had been charging the Henderson account for materials and labor that were actually being used on other projects. It wasn't technically illegal, but it was definitely unethical. I didn't have to do anything dramatic. I simply mailed copies of these billing discrepancies to Mr. Henderson anonymously, along with a note suggesting he might want to audit his account. She continues with quiet pride. I looked across our dinner table at David's frustrated face and said with complete sincerity, "That's so unfortunate, honey. Maybe they found someone more suitable for their needs." David had no idea he was looking at the person who just cost him his biggest client. Elena describes the growing pressure at David's firm. Around the same time, rumors began circulating at David's architecture firm about his relationship with Sophia. Now, I didn't start these rumors. I'm not that vindictive, but I did have lunch with my friend Maria, who works at the competing firm downtown. When Maria mentioned how unprofessional it looked when colleagues brought their personal relationships into the workplace, I simply agreed. Maria has always been very social, and information tends to spread quickly through Houston's architecture community. The consequences begin mounting. Within 2 weeks, David was dealing with uncomfortable questions from his business partners about office relationships and client confidence. The firm's reputation for professionalism was being questioned, and David found himself having awkward conversations with HR about maintaining appropriate workplace boundaries. Elena watches David's stress increase. David's behavior at home became increasingly erratic. He'd come home agitated, pacing around the kitchen while I prepared dinner. "Someone's been spreading gossip about Sophia and me," he'd complain. "It's completely unprofessional, and it's affecting our work environment." I'd nod sympathetically and say, "That must be so frustrating. People can be so petty about successful working relationships." She described Sophia's growing discomfort. Through Maria's network, I learned that Sophia was feeling the pressure, too. Other female colleagues were giving her the cold shoulder, and clients were requesting to work with different team members. The perfect professional image she cultivated was cracking under the weight of office politics and whispered conversations.
Elena's strategic patience becomes evident.
The most satisfying part was watching David realize that his secret relationship wasn't as secret as he'd thought. He'd come home paranoid, wondering who knew about the apartment, who'd seen them together, and how much people had figured out. Meanwhile, I continued my supportive wife routine, bringing him coffee and asking thoughtful questions about his day. Her voice becomes more confident. David was learning that living a double life is exhausting when people start paying attention. While he was scrambling to control the narrative at work, I was calmly preparing for the moment when I'd reveal that I knew everything. The man who thought he held all the power was about to discover just how powerless secrets make you when they start coming to light. Elena's voice becomes steady and purposeful as she describes the moment she finally took control. 2 months after I started my silent preparation, I decided it was time to end the charade. I called Romano's restaurant and made a reservation for 2 on a Thursday evening, the same day of the week when David had taken Sophia there months earlier. When I told David I wanted to have dinner together at our special place, he seemed genuinely surprised, maybe even hopeful that I was ready to work things out. She describes the careful staging of the confrontation. I chose Romano's deliberately because it was where our story began 34 years ago, and I wanted it to be where our story officially ended. I arrived 15 minutes early and requested our usual table by the window, overlooking the garden. I brought a manila folder with me, but I kept it in my purse until David arrived. Elena recalls David's demeanor. David walked in wearing his best suit and that charming smile he used to reserve just for me. He kissed my cheek and said, "Elena, you look beautiful tonight. This is a wonderful idea." He seemed relaxed, probably thinking that his patient wife had finally accepted their new normal and was ready to stop asking difficult questions. The conversation begins with deceptive normalcy. We ordered our usual appetizers and wine, and David actually seemed engaged for the first time in months. He told me about a new project at the firm, asked about my substitute teaching, and even mentioned that we should plan a vacation together soon. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, because he had no idea what was coming. Elena describes the pivotal moment. After our entrees arrived, I reached into my purse and placed the manila folder on the table between us, right next to the candle centerpiece. David glanced at it curiously, but didn't seem alarmed. I looked him directly in the eye and said very calmly, "David, I know about Sophia. I know about the apartment on Maple Street, the joint bank account, and the life insurance policy, where you've made her your primary beneficiary." She captures David's shock in detail. David's face went completely white, like all the blood had drained from his head. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and he just stared at me for what felt like forever. Finally, he set down his fork and said, "Elena, I can explain. It's not what you think." But his voice was shaking, and we both knew he was caught. Elena's strength becomes evident. I held up my hand to stop him and said, "David, I don't need explanations anymore. I need you to sign these divorce papers." I opened the folder and slid the documents across the table. Isabella drew them up. "Everything is fair and legal, but I'm not negotiating." The power dynamic shifts completely. David fumbled through the papers, his hands actually trembling. "Elena, please, we can work this out. Sophia doesn't mean anything to me. It was just a mistake, a midlife crisis." But I'd heard enough lies. I said, "David, you've spent 8 months building a life with another woman. You bought her jewelry with our money, took her to our honeymoon resort, and named her as your beneficiary. This isn't a mistake. It's a choice you made repeatedly." Elena's resolve remains unshakable. David tried everything: tears, apologies, promises to end things with Sophia immediately. But I just sat there calmly eating my dinner while he begged. Finally, I said, "David, you can sign these papers now. or Isabella will file them tomorrow and we'll go through the courts. Either way, our marriage is over. The only question is whether you want to handle this with dignity or drama." Her voice becomes final. David signed the papers right there at Romano's, at the same table where he'd proposed 34 years earlier. As he signed his name, I felt 32 years of emotional weight lift off my shoulders. Elena's voice takes on an almost ironic tone as she describes the ultimate twist of fate. 3 days after David signed the divorce papers at Romano's, I was at my new townhouse painting the guest bedroom a cheerful yellow when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Cedar Valley Hospital, and my heart immediately jumped to my throat. Despite everything David had put me through, 32 years of marriage doesn't just disappear when someone you once loved might be in danger. She describes the frantic rush to the hospital. Dr. Rebecca Hayes explained that David had suffered a massive heart attack at his office around 2:30 p.m. Mrs. Martinez, we performed emergency surgery to place 2 stents in his blocked arteries. He's stable now, but it was touch and go for a while. You got here very quickly. That's good. I realized David's office had called me because I was still listed as his emergency contact in their system. Elena sets the scene in the waiting room. I sat in that sterile hospital waiting room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting, thinking about our life together. Not just the recent betrayal, but the good years, too. David teaching Marcus to ride a bike, family Christmas mornings, the way he used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. I was angry at what he'd done to our marriage, but I didn't want him to die. The moment of revelation arrives. That's when Nurse Patricia approached me with her clipboard and that kind but professional smile. "Mrs. Martinez, we've updated your husband's information in our system. You're listed as his primary emergency contact, which is perfect since you're here. His other emergency contact should be arriving shortly." I looked up at her, confused.
I'm sorry.
"What other emergency contact?" Elena describes the shocking discovery. Patricia checked her tablet and said, "A Miss Sophia Chen. Actually, our records show she recently legally changed her name to Sophia Martinez. She's driving down from Dallas and should be here within the hour." I just stared at this nurse, processing what she'd just told me. This woman had not only been living with my husband, she had legally taken my name. The irony becomes clear. I sat there realizing that while David had been systematically removing me from his life insurance and bank accounts, he never bothered to update his work emergency contacts or his primary beneficiaries on his company life insurance policy. In his arrogance, he'd assumed I'd be completely out of the picture before anyone needed to check those details. Elena watches the final pieces fall into place. When Sophia walked through those hospital doors an hour later, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who expected to be in charge. She wore a navy business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was David's rightful next of kin. But when she approached the nurse's station, I watched her face change as she realized her legal name change meant nothing in a medical emergency where I was still listed as David's wife and primary contact. The ultimate justice unfolds. Here's the beautiful irony. While David was recovering, I learned from Isabella that his business was hemorrhaging money due to lost clients and reputation damage. Sophia was about to inherit a man with massive medical bills, a failing architecture firm, and no liquid assets because David had spent everything trying to impress her. Meanwhile, I'd already secured my fair share of our assets and had a fresh start waiting for me. Elena's voice becomes satisfied, but not vindictive. I looked at this woman who thought she was replacing me and realized she was actually inheriting David's problems while I was walking away with my freedom. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to someone, it's what you don't have to deal with anymore. Elena's voice becomes warmer but resolute as she describes the healing process with her family. 6 weeks after David's heart attack, I was settled into my new townhouse in Cedar Park, a cozy place with hardwood floors, a kitchen window that caught the morning sun, and a small backyard where I'd started growing tomatoes and herbs. For the first time in decades, every decision about my living space was mine alone. from the sage green paint in the living room to the reading nook I'd created by the bay window. She describes her children's initial reactions. Marcus was the first to visit, driving down from Denver on a weekend when his law firm gave him time off. I could see the conflict in his eyes as he walked through my new home. Pride in how well I was doing, but also sadness about his parents' divorce. We sat in my garden with iced tea, and he said something that broke my heart. "Mom, maybe you and Dad could try counseling. 32 years of marriage should count for something, right?" Elena's response shows her growth. I took Marcus's hands and looked into his brown eyes, David's eyes, and said, "Sweetheart, those 32 years do count for something. They taught me that I deserve a partner who chooses me every single day, not someone who keeps me as a backup plan while building a life with another woman." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Mom, you seem different, stronger, and I was stronger." She continues with Isabella's visit. Isabella drove over from Austin the following weekend, and I could immediately see the lawyer in her assessing my new situation. She walked through my townhouse, noting the security system, the financial independence, the way I'd created a space that was entirely my own. "Mom," she said, "this place feels like you. It's been so long since I've seen you in a space that actually reflects who you are." Elena describes Isabella's professional perspective. Over dinner at my new dining table, a small round oak piece I'd chosen myself, Isabella said, "As your daughter, I'm proud of how you've handled this. As a lawyer, I'm impressed by your strategic planning, but as a woman, I'm inspired by watching you reclaim your identity." Her words meant everything to me because Isabella had watched me disappear into David's shadow over the years. The conversation with Carmen becomes pivotal. My mother Carmen had moved into the senior living community nearby, and she visited every Tuesday for our new tradition, afternoon tea and tell-us. One Tuesday, she said something that surprised me. "Mia, I haven't seen you this happy since you were in college before you got married. You're blooming again." Then she paused and added, "Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." Elena addresses the family dynamics. The hardest part was explaining to my children why I couldn't just forgive and move forward. Marcus especially struggled with understanding why David's betrayal was unforgivable. But he's sorry now, Mom. He realizes he made a mistake. I had to help them understand that David wasn't sorry about hurting me. He was sorry about getting caught and losing his comfortable life. Her voice becomes more confident. What my children gradually came to see was that I wasn't angry or bitter. I was simply clear about my worth. I'd spent 32 years being someone's wife and mother. And now I was discovering who Elena Rodriguez was as an individual. I didn't need David's approval to validate my existence anymore, and I didn't need my children's permission to choose happiness over familiar dysfunction. Elena looks directly at the camera. The most beautiful part of this journey was watching my relationships with Marcus and Isabella deepen once they saw me as a complete person rather than just their selfless mother. I was finally modeling for them what it looks like to value yourself enough to walk away from people who don't appreciate your worth. Elena's voice becomes peaceful and reflective as she describes her life 8 months after the divorce was finalized. I'm standing in my third-grade classroom at Oakwood Elementary, watering the plants on my windowsill during my lunch break. Outside, I can see children playing on the playground, their laughter drifting through the window. It's a Thursday afternoon in late spring, and I've just finished helping my students with their creative writing projects, stories about brave characters who overcome challenges. She describes her transformed daily routine. My mornings now begin at 6 a.m. Not because someone else needs coffee, but because I love watching the sunrise from my kitchen window while I drink my own perfectly prepared tea. I read for 30 minutes before getting ready for school, something I never had time for when I was managing David's schedule. My evenings are spent grading papers, tending my garden, or having dinner with Carmen at her senior center. Every decision is mine. Elena reflects on unexpected growth. The most surprising discovery has been how much I love teaching again. Yesterday, one of my students, a shy little girl named Sophia, read her story aloud for the first time all year. As I watched her gain confidence with each sentence, I realized that's exactly what happened to me. I found my voice again after years of making myself smaller and quieter. She describes a moment of closure. Last week, my phone buzzed during my planning period. It was a text from David. Elena, I made the biggest mistake of my life. Sophia left when she realized the financial situation. The business is struggling, and I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment. Can we talk? I miss what we had. I read the message twice, then simply deleted it without responding. Elena's emotional evolution becomes clear. The old Elena would have felt guilty, would have wondered if I should at least try to help him or hear him out. But the woman I am now understands that David doesn't miss me. He misses the convenience I provided, the stability I created while he pursued his midlife fantasy. He's not reaching out because he values me. He's reaching out because his other options have disappeared. She describes finding peace. I walked over to my classroom window and looked out at the playground where children were learning to navigate friendships, resolve conflicts, and discover their own strengths. I realized that at 58 years old, I was finally learning those same lessons. David thought he could keep me as his safety net while he explored other possibilities. But instead, he taught me that I'm strong enough to build my own net. Elena's voice grows stronger with conviction. That evening, I was deadheading roses in my garden when my neighbor, Mrs. Chun, no relation to Sophia, stopped by with fresh zucchini from her garden. As we chatted about our plants and shared stories about our grandchildren, I realized this was what contentment felt like. Not the desperate happiness of trying to please someone else, but the quiet satisfaction of living authentically. She shares the core lesson. The nurse at the hospital was right that day. There was another emergency contact, but it wasn't Sophia Chun or any other woman. It was the person I'd forgotten I could be. Elena Rodriguez, the woman who didn't need David's approval to exist, who could make decisions without consulting anyone, who could build a life based on her own dreams and values. Elena looks directly at the camera with genuine peace in her eyes. David's betrayal was devastating, but it became the greatest gift he ever gave me. It forced me to remember that I was complete before I met him, and I'm complete now without him. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't getting even with someone who hurt you. It's getting happy despite them. And I finally am.